All right, amazing. Can everyone see my screen and everything else? Yes? Okay. All right. I decided to do this like partially about reconstruction along with weighing and the different weighing metrics that you use. The reason why I did this is because honestly, like while weighing is super important in terms of doing it in your constructive, doing it in your refutation, all of that, where I think it is oftentimes most present and where I think it is oftentimes most underestimated is within the reconstruction. And I think that this is also I also wanted to specify Reconstruction specifically because I think a lot of deputy speakers have a tendency to prioritize Reconstruction less than refutation. But I've noticed that at this point, my deputy speeches have become like 50% of each because Reconstruction is just that important and it's oftentimes a really great opportunity for you to both weigh your arguments and stay relevant in the round. So I'll start off a little bit briefly on Reconstruction. The Reconstruction seminar might be a bit basic, but let's go through it anyways. What are the main objectives of Reconstruction? It's to refute the refutation made against your partner's arguments, it's to solidify your partner's arguments, and it's to weigh your team's contributions against the others. So refuting the other side's refutation is pretty simple, right? It's like explaining why the response is wrong, why the response doesn't necessarily address the main premise or the main impacts of your argument, and why does your argument perhaps anticipate this response already, are all questions to consider within refutation. But the more important part that I think a lot of people oftentimes forget about within Reconstruction is making sure that your partner's arguments are better than they were initially presented. And I think one of the most important pieces of feedback I've ever gotten is from this like old Hart House debater, Lex. I don't know if any of y'all know her, but she was like a really, really like, she was like Hart House A like many, many years ago. And she told us that the deputy speech is much more similar to the extension speech than any other speech in the round. And I think the reason why that's true is relatively simple, which is extensions are oftentimes built off of giving new mechanisms, new impacts, and new context that fill in the gaps of your opening's arguments. In the same way, you as a deputy speaker have a unique opportunity to do that before your closing does. So you both want to make sure that your partner's arguments are as solidified as possible, along with ensuring that your closing doesn't necessarily have the ground necessary to fill in the gaps in your argument. So the first part of that then is listening carefully to your partner and being critical in the way a judge would be. Did they forget an important mechanism? Did they run out of time and forget important ideas? Were there tensions in their case that needs to be resolved? And within that as well, there's an opportunity to add new content to the arguments that looks like things such as new examples, new mechanisms, and new impacts within your arguments as well. But the final part that is super important is illustrating the argument. What does this argument look like is a question that you should be actively saying out loud and actively answering during your speech as well. Make the case clear and concrete. Tell me how it affects people in real life. Tell me how it leads to real change in the world. So I think there's a couple common mistakes that people oftentimes make when they reconstruct, though. It includes things such as simply repeating your partner's case, failing to address the concerns pointed out by the other team, and not filling the gaps in your partner's case, which is especially important in BP rounds. But the other part of that as well, that I think is oftentimes, and I'll get into this a little bit more in a second, is using weighing mechanisms that are assertive. For example, saying, oh, my partner gave deeper analysis, or my partner gave more important analysis, without meaningfully giving me reasons why your analysis is more important or why your analysis is deeper as well. So final bits of advice regarding Reconstruction specifically is spend lots of time highlighting the most high impact contributions. What were the most important mechanisms you provide? What were the key insights that your team provided the judge should weigh heavily in the debate? And you want to push burdens and responsibilities onto the other side as well. Let them know that not responding to your ideas is a critical mistake. For BP, let the other teams on the back half know that they need to tackle your ideas. If you're on opening government and you establish the comparative in the debate, you say this is what opposition has to defend. You have to be very clear that closing opposition, in order to get any of their benefits in extension, has to first engage with your arguments as well and first engage with the comparative that you set up. The final part of that, and the bigger trend of all of this, is don't just be defensive. Be offensive. Show how your material clashes directly with the other sides and show how your material is more important than the other sides. So that leads me to now to talking about the weighing metrics. How do we adjudicate the importance of certain arguments? So starting off then talking about framing. What framing essentially is explaining why an argument is important in the context of the debate. It's a lens of analysis through which judges prioritize a given team's contributions as well. Why is framing important? Arguments in a debate must be both true and important. Those are the two oftentimes most key metrics on how we adjudicate arguments. Framing is important because it tells the judge how they should weigh up arguments. It pushes out ideas that may be irrelevant or less important in the round as well. So there's a few different types of weighing metrics, and within each of those types, there are a bunch of different metrics. The first type is simply the scale of impact of your argument, the consequences of your argument. And there's three things to consider here: the magnitude, the depth of impact, and the vulnerability. On magnitude, this one's pretty simple. How big is the impact? Does it affect more people than the other side's argument? Does it help society more overall? And it's really important to consider these questions because it simply gives the judge a very simple criteria with which to weigh your impacts against others. But the second one that people oftentimes forget is depth of impact. If the impact doesn't help the most people, or it doesn't help affect the largest number of people, does it help a certain group a lot? Or does it affect a certain group a lot? Why should we prioritize that? So I think a really good way to think about the differences between magnitude and depth of impact is something like free trade, right? If I was a proponent of free trade, I'd argue in favor of, like, let's say that my argument in favor of free trade was, we reduce costs for everyone, we reduce prices for everyone. In that instance, I'm weighing on magnitude. I say 100% of the society is benefited by increased free trade that allows for cheaper goods for everyone. Now, if I'm weighing depth of impact though, and I'm going against free trade, one of the things I might say is government's true, right? Maybe you make sure that 100% of the people have slightly cheaper prices. The problem is that 10% of the population lose their jobs because they get outcompeted as a consequence of free trade. And the loss of jobs for that 10% of people is such a large depth of impact, such a large amount of impact for them individually, that you should prioritize that depth of impact over the number of people that might be affected in government side. So in depth of impact, you're considering how deeply are people actually affected. The final metric then is vulnerability. And this one's really simple, right? If I take away $10 from a poor person compared to a rich person, I think that the scale of that impact is much larger. I also would note that the impact might help or affect a specific vulnerable group of people that we as a government have more of a principled obligation to, right? Due to things such as structural oppression, due to things such as previous state policy that might have been incredibly problematic, we have more of a moral obligation to help those that are more vulnerable. So proving that you help or affect the more vulnerable in a certain way is oftentimes a very good way to weigh your argument and prove that the argument is simply more important as well. So that's on magnitude and consequences of the argument. Are there any questions so far? No, we're good. All right, amazing. I can't see everyone, so if there are, just like let me know or unmute yourself. Okay. The second type of metric is debate-specific weighing metrics. So the first part of this is likelihood. Are your arguments more likely to happen than theirs? Did your mechanism properly prove your impacts? And I want to note something that I think a lot of people oftentimes forget. Whenever you are mitigating an argument, whenever you are saying, this argument doesn't seem very true, or whenever you're giving reasons why an argument is unlikely, you are always using the likelihood metric, right? That's why, like, the first thing we teach you guys whenever we talk about refutation is to try to prove that the other side's argument is untrue. The reason why you do that is because it ultimately goes down to the clash of likelihood. How likely are your arguments to happen compared to the other side's arguments? In that instance, proving that your arguments are more likely to happen than theirs, or that your mechanisms are more likely to achieve the impacts that you have compared to the other side's, is important. It's important, therefore, whenever you're giving a response, such as, this argument is not true for this reason, that you conclude that response, that you say, what that means for the debate is maybe opposition's argument has a 10% chance of happening, 20% chance of happening, compared to the mechanisms we provide, which prove that in multiple instances, instances, in 100% of instances, this is likely to happen. So it's important to conclude your responses, maybe not saying that exactly because that seems a little bit weird, but making sure that it's very clear to the judge that you are winning on the metric of likelihood. The second is relevance. And this is what we oftentimes use whenever we are talking about the mutual exclusivity of an argument, right? When we prove that there is, that's uniqueness. Relevance is along that line as well, which is to prove that your argument is relevant to that debate. But on uniqueness, can your side and impacts uniquely achieve the goals you set out? Were they mutually exclusive, i.e., the impact can only happen on one side? This is why a lot of times when you see a few more high-level debaters debating, oftentimes one of the things that you oftentimes see them do is ask the question in their argument, why are other alternatives unlikely or likely to also lead to this impact? So for example, if I'm on Gov for a motion and I'm trying to solve a unique problem, what I also want to set up in the comparative is some time explaining why this mechanism is the only one that can achieve this impact. For example, saying the other side, like here are the alternatives that the other side can support. Here's why they are unlikely to work. So for example, if I'm arguing that like we should have a universal basic income, I have to first prove that targeted welfare schemes don't lead to the goals that we want, right? So like explaining that a little bit more. For BP, were your arguments unique out of the 4 teams? If so, why is that good? That's also something to consider. And that's exactly what I'm gonna get into now, talking a lot about weighing against your opening. I think there's 4 main ways that people can oftentimes weigh against their opening. But before I get into those, I think one thing people oftentimes forget to consider in British parliamentary is when you're a closing team, your opening is oftentimes an even larger threat to you than the other side's teams. The tendency of a lot of people is for them to like just focus a lot on refuting the other bench as opposed to explicitly weighing against their opening. But weighing against their opening, if I'm on CG, weighing against my OG is about as important to me as refuting the opening opposition or refuting the closing opposition. And thus, I recommend you dedicate about as much time weighing against your opening as well. So there's a few ways that I think weighing against opening can be done. The first is to note the problems within opening half that your team uniquely solves. So for example, is your opening focused on the wrong comparative? Are they focused on the wrong group of people? Are they focused on the wrong location? So in that instance, making sure that there are problems within your opening that you uniquely solve is really, really helpful. The second part of this is note the holes in your opening arguments that make their arguments dependent on yours. So does your opening not prove their arguments are likely or not prove that their arguments are important? And in that instance, point that out. What my partner and I tend to do is we do something called stop and start analysis, which is you want to be very clear about where your openings mechanism stops and where yours start. Whenever I give an extension, I first give an overview of what has happened in the opening debate so far to identify where strategically my extension suits into the round. And that's the best way you can oftentimes position your extension to be important in the round as well. The third thing, and this one's sneaky, and I really love this one, use the other opening team's rebuttal to point out gaps. If OG gives an argument and you are on CG, use opening opposition's refutation against them, right? So oftentimes, if OG has an argument, let's say that they give argument X, and opening opposition responds with argument Y to prove that argument X is unlikely, then in closing, all you have to do in order to weigh against argument X is say, opening government told you about argument X, but opening opposition correctly points out that argument X is unlikely because of response Y. As a consequence, OG's argument is less likely than our argument about this. And in that instance, you sneakily are using the other opening's refutation against them. This is also a really good way to engage in the debate, right? Because you are proving that at this point, opening opposition is beating OG about something. And then if you refute opening opposition's refutation, or if your extension is impervious to opening opposition's refutation, then you prove that you beat out both of them at the same time. So you're not just weighing against your opening government, you're proving that you're winning the entire clash that is coming out of opening half as a whole. The final thing to consider then is to identify gridlocks in the openings clash, right? So maybe the OG and opening opposition both talk about different groups of people, but don't weigh why those different groups of people are more or less important than one another, in which case you can provide the weighing. Maybe opening half gives like OG gives one argument that an X group will respond in Y way, and then opening opposition says X group will respond in X way instead, right? X group will respond in Z way instead, right? In that instance, prove why it is more likely that they will respond in Y way than Z way. In that instance, what you want to do is you want to identify that there is a gridlock going on in opening half, that there is a tie essentially with their arguments, in which neither argument is proven to be more likely than the other, or neither argument is proven to be more important than the other. That's when you can uniquely position yourself in two ways. Number one, by either providing an extension that breaks those deadlocks, or number two, even more sneakily, if you have an extension that's about an entirely different clash anyways, give just 2 or 3 responses that might break this deadlock. So you're proving that you're not just winning on your extensions theme, but you're also proving that you're winning on the theme that opening half is already stuck in a deadlock in and have dedicated a lot of time for as well. That's the end of my seminar. I wanted to see if anyone had any questions.
I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So like your third point about using like OO's responses, for instance, to engage with OG. So is like knifing okay?
Okay, so literally RP and I took a third because we just knifed our OG way too hard. The way that we try to justify it is knifing is not okay, but the way that you say it is the opening opposition challenge was not met by opening government, right? Or you say that opening opposition's refutation proves that OG's arguments, while existent, are not always as likely, right? So it's using the same weighing metrics that we were discussing previously. In that instance, you aren't openly contradicting your opening half. You're identifying that one of the critiques against their argument might actually be true, and you use that in your own favor as well. Good question, though. It is important to distinguish that it is not a knife. That is oftentimes something to explicitly say. A sneaky knife, yeah, absolutely. That's always the most fun. Are there any other questions?
Elton has one in the chat.
Yeah, for sure. Having a select amount of people being impacted compared to more people being impacted. So 2 ways. The first and most important is depth, right? If you can prove, so let's go back to the free trade example, right? What I'm saying is, yes, 100%, there will be like only 10% of the population affected, as opposed to 100% of the population that is benefited from free trade. But the argument then is the loss of jobs as a scale of impact and with the deepness of impact on that specific group of people is so much larger than every individual in society getting marginally cheaper prices. So if you are weighing on a smaller group of individuals, that's when it's super important to explain that the impact affects them so much more deeply than the much larger group of people that the other side has. The second one as well is like vulnerability. There's more of a moral obligation on governments. I would also note that vulnerability, and specifically talking about a vulnerable group, is oftentimes also meets the other metrics, right? I.e. the depth of impact on that particular group that might have less of an ability to protect themselves or less of an ability to get some sort of reparative justice for whatever problems they experience. That group as a consequence also have a much larger depth of impact as well. I hope that answers the question. Let me know if there's others. All right, amazing.
All right. Does anybody else have questions at all? Great time to ask. If not, thank you so much, Chris. That was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for taking your time to do that.
Thank you, y'all.